Have you ever been sued over something that literally doesn't exist? I have. It sounds like the setup to a bizarre joke, but I assure you, the legal documents were very real, the threats were tangible, and the absolute absurdity of it all was enough to make a saint swear. The lawsuit was for a dog. A noisy, rule-breaking, phantom dog that supposedly lived in my house. A house that has only ever been occupied by myself and a collection of suspiciously well-behaved houseplants. This whole saga began because I, Alex, a man whose professional life revolves around forensic accounting, the art of finding truth in numbers, decided to buy a house in what I thought was a peaceful, quiet suburban neighborhood. I craved tranquility. My job involves untangling complex webs of deceit spun by corporate criminals, and when I come home, I want my biggest problem to be choosing what to watch on TV, not engaging in a land war in my own cul-de-sac. But my desire for peace ran headlong into Carol Covington, the president of our Homeowners Association, and a woman who wielded her clipboard like a royal scepter. My first interaction with her was an email, clinical and cold, informing me of a violation. "Dear Mr. Miller," it began, "it has come to the attention of the board that a dog has been heard barking from your property for extended periods, in violation of Bylaw 74C. Please rectify this situation immediately." I chuckled, assuming it was a simple mistake, a misdirected email meant for a neighbor. I replied politely, explaining that I didn't own a dog, or any pets for that matter, and that the noise must be coming from elsewhere. I thought that would be the end of it. How naive I was. Carol's reply came within minutes, sharp and dismissive. She had multiple, credible reports, and considered the matter far from closed. What Carol Covington didn't know, what she couldn't possibly comprehend, was that her petty tyranny had just targeted a man who dismantles empires built on lies for a living. She had, with one arrogant email, made her little HOA kingdom my next pro bono project. Have you ever dealt with an HOA president who thinks they're the queen of a country they don't own? Let me know in the comments, because I have a feeling my story will sound disturbingly familiar to some of you. Stick around, because the tale of how I used her own rulebook, a bit of 21st century technology, and the cold, hard logic of a balance sheet to bring her reign of suburban terror to a screeching, public halt is one for the ages. She thought she was suing me over a ghost dog. She had no idea she was actually inviting a full-scale audit of her entire, corrupt little world. My initial attempt at a reasonable resolution was met with a wall of pure, unadulterated arrogance. Following Carol's dismissive email, I decided a more personal, good neighborly approach might defrost the situation. I drafted a second message, even more conciliatory than the first. I reiterated that there was no dog on my premises and, in a gesture of complete transparency, I offered to let her, or any designated board member, conduct a walkthrough of my home at their convenience. Perhaps, I wrote, trying to sound as cooperative as possible, this would be the quickest way to clear up this misunderstanding for everyone. I even suggested we could work together to identify the actual source of the barking in the neighborhood. I was extending an olive branch. Carol took that olive branch, doused it in gasoline, and lit it on fire. Her response was a formal, certified letter that arrived 3 days later. It wasn't an email this time. It was official HOA letterhead, a document designed to intimidate. The letter stated that my denial was noted but not accepted. It included the first fine, $100 for a violation of Bylaw 74C. It also contained a new, more sinister phrase, audio evidence. Apparently, she now possessed a recording of my phantom canine's transgressions. The tone was no longer just dismissive. It was prosecutorial. It was the letter of someone who wasn't looking for a solution but was relishing a conflict. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate act of aggression. My frustration, which had been a low simmer, began to boil. My professional instincts, long dormant in my personal life, started to flicker awake. A forensic accountant doesn't just accept the top-line number, they scrutinize the source data. Carol claimed to have evidence, so my first step was to analyze the framework that gave her the power to levy fines in the first place. I spent the next weekend, a weekend I had planned to dedicate to assembling a new grill, poring over the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and RS, the bylaws, and the minutes from the last 5 years of board meetings. It was hundreds of pages of dense, mind-numbing legalese, but to me, it was a treasure map. In these documents, perpetrators of mismanagement always leave a trail. They hide their misdeeds not in what is written, but in what is omitted, or in how the written rules are selectively applied. I read every line, every clause, every procedural requirement for issuing violations, collecting fines, and adjudicating disputes. I highlighted sections, cross-referenced appendices, and made notes in the margins. My living room looked less like a home and more like a law library preparing for a landmark case. I discovered, for instance, that the bylaws required verifiable, dated evidence for any fine to be valid. What did Carol's audio evidence consist of? Was it time-stamped? Was it professionally analyzed to determine the location? Or was it just her holding her phone up in the general direction of my house? I also found the clauses that gave homeowners the right to inspect all financial records, contracts, and communications of the board. It was a right, not a privilege, and it was powerfully worded. A seed of a plan began to form, a strategy shifting from simple defense to a comprehensive counteroffensive. Carol thought this was about a dog. I was beginning to realize it was about everything else. The situation escalated with the cold, predictable momentum of a runaway train. I formally contested the $100 fine in writing, citing the section of the bylaws that required verifiable evidence and respectfully requesting a copy of this supposed audio recording. In response, I received another certified letter. This one informed me that my appeal was denied by the Architectural Control Committee, which I later learned consisted of Carol, her best friend, and one other crony. The letter also included a second fine for a continued violation, this time for $250. My phantom dog was getting more expensive by the week. It was clear that playing by her twisted version of the rules was a losing game. I decided I needed to confront her face-to-face. The perfect opportunity was the monthly HOA board meeting, a sparsely attended affair usually held in the community clubhouse. I arrived early and took a seat. The meeting droned on with tedious discussions about pool chemicals and seasonal planning schedules. When the floor was opened for homeowner comments, I stood up and calmly introduced myself. I began to explain the situation, but before I could get more than 2 sentences out, Carol cut me off. "Mr. Miller, this is not the forum for individual compliance issues," she said, her voice dripping with condescending authority. "We have a process for that, which you have been following. This is for general community business." She was using the rules of order to publicly humiliate and silence me, framing me as some malcontent who didn't understand procedure. A few of her board allies nodded sagely. The handful of other residents present just looked uncomfortable, eager to avoid the splash zone of her wrath. I was dismissed. I left that meeting not just frustrated, but furious. The public shutdown was a declaration of war. 2 weeks later, the war arrived on my doorstep in the form of a bewildered-looking process server. He handed me a thick envelope containing a summons. The Westbridge Landing Homeowners Association was officially suing me in small claims court to collect the unpaid fines and to secure a court order demanding I abate the nuisance, which is to say, get rid of the dog that did not exist. I stood there on my porch, holding the papers, and I started to laugh. It wasn't a small chuckle. It was a deep, incredulous, belly laugh. The sheer, unadulterated absurdity of it all just broke through my frustration. I was being sued by a cabal of suburban despots over a creature of their own imagination. The process server gave me a strange look, shrugged, and walked away. My laughter must have carried, because apparently Carol, whose house was diagonally across the street, was watching from her window. To her, a woman marinated in her own self-importance, my laughter was not a sign of disbelief, but of mockery. It was an act of defiance against her authority. Less than 10 minutes later, as I was sitting on my porch swing, reading the ridiculous legal filing, a police car pulled up to my curb. 2 officers got out, looking tired and wary. Carol had called them. She had reported that I was creating a disturbance, laughing maniacally, and possibly harassing her. The officers approached, and I calmly explained the situation, showing them the lawsuit papers. I could see the moment the absurdity dawned on them, too. One of them sighed, a deep, weary sigh that spoke volumes about how his day was going. "Sir, as long as you're on your own property and not yelling at anyone, you're not breaking any laws," he said, giving a pointed look toward Carol's house. "Have a good day." They got back in their car and drove away, leaving me there with the lawsuit papers in my hand. That was the moment everything changed. Carol had escalated from petty fines and bureaucratic bullying to filing a frivolous lawsuit and, now, making a false police report. She hadn't just crossed a line, she had obliterated it. The laughter subsided, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. My desire for peace was officially dead and buried. My new goal was justice, and my definition of justice had just expanded considerably. The sight of the police cruiser pulling away from my house was a clarifying moment, the kind that burns away all the fog of frustration and leaves behind a single, gleaming purpose. Carol Covington wasn't just a power-tripping HOA president. She was a bully who used the mechanisms of civil society, bylaws, lawsuits, even law enforcement, as her personal cudgel. My laughter had been a spontaneous reaction to absurdity, but her response was a calculated abuse of power. I went inside, laid the lawsuit on my kitchen island, and took a deep breath. The defensive posture I had maintained until now was a mistake. You don't reason with a bully. You dismantle their power structure piece by piece until they have no platform left to stand on. My professional life had trained me for this. The game had changed, and I was now going to be the one setting the rules of engagement. My first move was to formally request information, an action I was entitled to as a homeowner according to the very bylaws Carol claimed to cherish. I spent that evening drafting a meticulous, legally precise letter. Citing Section 92 of the HOA covenants, I requested access to and copies of the last 7 years of all financial records, every budget, every monthly expense report, every bank statement, every invoice, and every contract awarded to an outside vendor. I didn't stop there. I also requested all board meeting minutes, all architectural committee decisions, and all official communications related to rule enforcement for the same 7-year period. I sent the letter via certified mail with a return receipt requested. This wasn't a polite ask. It was a formal, legally backed demand for discovery. The bylaws gave the board 30 days to comply. The clock was now ticking on Carol's carefully curated kingdom. While I waited for the paper trail to arrive, I initiated the second prong of my investigation. My hobby, something I did for relaxation, was about to become a powerful tool. I own a high-end, commercial-grade drone equipped with a high-resolution camera. I use it for landscape and architectural photography. That weekend, I began a new project, a comprehensive aerial survey of the entire Westbridge Landing subdivision. I flew my drone at permissible altitudes, meticulously documenting every single property from multiple angles. My stated purpose, should anyone ask, was creating a portfolio of modern suburban architecture. My actual purpose was to build a database of every single rule violation in the community. I created a spreadsheet, cross-referencing each property's address with a checklist of HOA rules from the CC and RS. Was the mailbox the approved color? Were there unapproved sheds or fences? Were trash cans visible from the street on non-collection days? Were commercial vehicles parked overnight? My forensic accountant's mind thrilled at the process, collecting raw data, organizing it, and searching for patterns. And a pattern began to emerge very quickly. The neighborhood was rife with minor violations, the kind of trivial infractions that a reasonable board would ignore. But the key discovery was the distribution of those violations. The properties belonging to Carol Covington, her vice president, the treasurer, and the secretary, the very people who had shut me down and rubber-stamped my fines, were some of the worst offenders. This wasn't just about my phantom dog anymore. This was about systemic hypocrisy. I was no longer just a defendant in a frivolous lawsuit. I was becoming an investigator, building a case not just for my own innocence, but for Carol's profound malfeasance. She had accused me of one imaginary violation. I was on my way to proving dozens of real ones, and they were all pointing directly back at her and her inner circle. The boxes of documents arrived on the 30th day, the absolute deadline of the board's legal requirement to comply. It was clear they had waited as long as possible, hoping I would simply forget. The delivery driver wheeled 2 large banker's boxes up to my door. To an ordinary person, it would have been an intimidating mountain of paper, a chaotic jumble of numbers and jargon. To me, it was paradise. I spent the next week of evenings transforming my dining room into a forensic accounting war room. I spread the documents out, sorting them by year and category: bank statements, invoices, contracts, budget reports. I entered key figures into a master spreadsheet, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I was in my element, hunting for the scent of deceit that I knew so well from my day job. For the first few days, everything seemed frustratingly mundane. The numbers were messy, the bookkeeping was amateurish, but there was no single, glaring gotcha moment. And then I found it. It wasn't in a single document, but in the pattern. I had isolated all the major expenditures for landscaping, pool maintenance, snow removal, and general repairs. Over 7 years, the vast majority of these contracts, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, had been awarded to a single company, Covington Landscape and Home Services. The name was a colossal red flag. A quick search of the state's online business registry gave me everything I needed. The sole proprietor of Covington Landscape and Home Services was a man named Darren Covington. A little more digging on social media, and I hit the jackpot. A public photo on Carol's sister's page from a family barbecue. There was Carol, arm in arm with her smiling brother-in-law, Darren. There was no record in any of the HOA meeting minutes of Carol ever disclosing this massive conflict of interest. Worse, when I did a quick market analysis, calling 3 other local landscaping and maintenance companies for quotes based on the scope of work described in the contracts, their estimates came in, on average, 30 to 40% lower than what Darren's company was charging the HOA. Our community was being systematically overcharged to enrich the president's family. While this financial bombshell was taking shape, my aerial surveillance project was yielding its own spectacular results. My drone had become the ultimate, impartial observer. I now had a high-resolution, time-stamped photograph of the HOA treasurer's sprawling, unapproved deck extension, a clear violation of the rules on structural additions. I had footage of the HOA secretary's branded Kathy's Catering van parked in her driveway every single night for a week, a blatant breach of the no commercial vehicles rule. And best of all, I had crystal-clear images of Carol Covington's own property. Her fence was painted a shade of off-white that was explicitly disallowed in the CC and RS. She had an unapproved satellite dish on her roof, and her prize-winning rose bushes were encroaching 3 feet onto the common area. These were precisely the kinds of petty infractions she relentlessly fined other residents for. I had the photo of the violation notice she sent to an elderly widow, Mrs. Gable, for a garden gnome that was, and I quote, 2 inches in excess of the approved height for decorative lawn statuary. The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost beautiful in its perfection. The plan crystallized in my mind, elegant and devastating. It would be a 3-pronged attack. First, the legal front. I would hire a lawyer and file a blistering countersuit for malicious prosecution, harassment, and breach of fiduciary duty. We would subpoena Carol for a deposition. Second, the financial front. I would compile my findings into a professional, airtight forensic report, complete with charts, graphs, and market comparisons. Third, and most deliciously, the public front. The HOA's annual meeting, where the budget was approved and the board was elected, was in 6 weeks. I would stage a coup. I would stand before the entire community and, with the clinical precision of an auditor and the undeniable power of visual evidence, I would expose Carol Covington not as a diligent protector of property values, but as a corrupt, self-serving hypocrite. She thought she was fighting a man with a dog. She was about to find out she was fighting a man with a case. With a fully formed strategy, I moved from investigation to execution. The first order of business was to professionalize my legal fight. I researched local attorneys and found the perfect fit, a man named Arthur Vance, a semi-retired litigator with a reputation as a shark who delighted in taking on bullies. During our consultation, I laid out the entire story, finishing with my financial and photographic evidence. Vance listened intently, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Mr. Miller," he said, leaning back in his leather chair, "this is not a small claims defense. This is a feast. Frivolous lawsuits, breach of fiduciary duty, potential fraud. They've handed us a sledgehammer. Within a week, Vance had filed a comprehensive countersuit in Superior Court. It was a masterpiece of legal aggression, seeking not just the dismissal of their ridiculous claim, but also punitive damages for harassment, my own legal fees, and a court order to force an independent audit of the HOA's finances. The centerpiece of our initial volley was a subpoena for Carol Covington to be deposed under oath. The moment that subpoena was served, the dynamic of the conflict shifted forever. Carol's lawyer, a man who likely took the HOA's case assuming it was a simple fee collection, called Vance almost immediately. He proposed they drop their suit if we dropped ours. Vance, on my instructions, laughed and refused. "We'll see you at the deposition," he said cheerfully. While the legal gears were turning, I began the community-level phase of my plan. I couldn't just show up to the annual meeting and drop a bomb. I needed to prepare the ground. I started taking evening walks around the neighborhood, striking up casual conversations with my neighbors. I never mentioned my lawsuit or my grand plan. Instead, I listened. I heard the story of the young family fined because their children's basketball hoop was left out an hour past the 8 p.m. curfew. I spoke with a man who had been forced to repaint his front door 3 times because Carol couldn't decide if the shade was Tuscan beige or desert sand. And of course, I had a long, sympathetic chat with Mrs. Gable, the sweet elderly woman who had been terrorized over her garden gnome. I found a community simmering with resentment, all directed at Carol. They had all been too intimidated to fight back alone. I subtly encouraged them all to attend the upcoming annual meeting, telling them, "I think there are going to be some important financial matters discussed that everyone will want to hear." I was building a silent coalition, an audience that was already primed for a revolution. Carol, oblivious to the storm gathering around her, grew even more arrogant. With the countersuit filed against her, she clearly felt the need to reassert her authority. She began posting passive-aggressive notices on the community bulletin board. A reminder, following our community rules is essential for maintaining property values and ensuring a harmonious living environment for everyone. Another read. Disruptive residents who refuse to comply with established regulations will be met with the full enforcement powers of the association. She was shadowboxing with me in public, trying to paint me as a lawless troublemaker. She genuinely believed she was in the right, that her power was absolute and her position was secure. She saw my fight as an affront, and her response was to double down, convinced that she could crush me with the sheer weight of her office. Every new notice she posted, every condescending email she sent out to the community, was just another shovelful of dirt for the grave she was digging for herself. She was so focused on the battle, she couldn't see that the war was already lost. The deposition was the turning point, the moment my strategy shifted from theory to hard, actionable fact. We held it in Arthur Vance's conference room. Carol arrived with her lawyer, looking confident and severe, dressed in a power suit, as if she were addressing a Senate committee instead of answering questions about a phantom dog. I sat next to Vance, silent, my role simply to observe and take notes. Vance began gently, establishing a baseline of simple facts. Then, he moved to the heart of the matter. "Mrs. Covington," he began, his tone deceptively mild. "In your lawsuit, you claim Mr. Miller owns a dog that creates a nuisance. Is that correct?" "Yes, that is correct," she said, her voice firm. "And have you, personally, ever seen this dog?" Vance asked. There was a brief hesitation. "I have heard it," she said, dodging. "I have also received multiple, reliable reports from other residents." "I see," Vance said, making a note. "And who are these residents who made these reports?" Her lawyer immediately interjected. "We're not going to provide names. We need to protect residents from potential harassment," Vance smiled. "Of course. Let's move on. The board is responsible for fiscal management, correct? You approve all major contracts." "Yes," Carol said proudly. "We are very diligent stewards of the community's funds." "Excellent," Vance said, leaning forward. Is the HOA's landscaping and maintenance contract awarded through a fair and competitive bidding process? Absolutely, she said without a flicker of doubt. We always solicit multiple bids and choose the vendor that provides the best value for the community. She was lying, confidently and brazenly, under oath. Perjury. It was beautiful. Vance continued for another hour, asking detailed questions about the fence colors, the commercial vehicle rules, the process for approving structural additions. With every answer, Carol built her own cage, constructing a version of reality that was pristine, fair, and utterly false. The entire deposition was recorded and transcribed by a court reporter. Her sworn testimony was now a pristine, unassailable weapon waiting to be deployed. Meanwhile, the bait for the final trap was laid. As required by the bylaws, the HOA board sent out the agenda for the annual meeting 1 month in advance. Included in the packet was the proposed budget for the upcoming year. I scanned it eagerly, and there it was, on page 3, under Projected Major Expenditures, a line item for landscaping and grounds maintenance for $150,000, payable to Covington Landscape and Home Services. They hadn't even bothered to change the vendor. Their arrogance was my greatest asset. With the deposition transcript and the proposed budget in hand, I spent the final 2 weeks preparing my presentation. I was no graphic designer, but I knew how to present data. I created a clean, professional PowerPoint slideshow. I embedded the high-resolution drone photos. I created charts showing the price disparity between Covington Landscape and its competitors. I scanned and highlighted sections of the CC and RS and juxtaposed them with photos of the board members' own violations. I digitized snippets of Carol's deposition transcript, ready to display her words next to the cold, hard evidence that proved them to be lies. The entire presentation was designed to be a slow, methodical demolition. It wasn't an emotional rant. It was a clinical audit, a factual expose that would leave no room for doubt or denial. The night before the meeting, I ran through the presentation one last time. Every slide was a nail. Every piece of evidence was a hammer blow. Carol Covington was marching to her own public execution, and she had even been kind enough to send out the invitations. The community clubhouse was packed. I had never seen it so full. My quiet campaign of encouraging attendance had worked better than I'd hoped. Mrs. Gable gave me a small, determined nod from the second row. The family with the basketball hoop sat near the back, watching with keen interest. The air was thick with anticipation. At the front of the room, Carol Covington stood at a podium, flanked by her board. She was radiant with self-satisfaction, clearly misinterpreting the large crowd as a sign of her own popularity and the community's engagement. She ran through the opening pleasantries and then launched into the main event, the presentation of the budget for the upcoming year. She spoke with her usual air of supreme competence, explaining the necessity of various expenditures. Finally, she arrived at the landscaping contract. And for our grounds maintenance, we will be continuing our successful partnership with Covington Landscape, which has provided reliable service for years. She smiled, then said, I will now entertain a motion to approve the budget as presented. A hand. One of her cronies shot up. So moved. Is there a second? Carol asked, her eyes scanning the room for the inevitable. But before another hand could go up, I stood. Madam President, I said, my voice calm but loud enough to fill the room. Before we vote, I have a few questions and some information to present regarding the budget and some other matters of community governance. I believe every homeowner here will find it relevant. I've prepared a short presentation. Carol's face tightened. Mr. Miller, this is highly irregular. There is a motion on the floor. I move that we table the current motion in order to allow Mr. Miller to speak, a clear voice called out. It was Mrs. Gable, her voice shaking slightly but full of resolve. Is there a second to that motion? Another resident shouted from the back. A chorus of second erupted. A vote was called, and the motion to let me speak passed with a deafening roar of aye. Carol was stunned into silence. Her control of the meeting had just been wrested from her. I walked to the front, connected my laptop to the projector, and the first slide illuminated the screen behind the stun board. It read, A Review of Community Governance and Fiscal Responsibility, presented by Alex Miller. I clicked to the next slide. Let's start with the issue that brought me here, I said. An audio waveform appeared on screen. I played a 15-second clip of a dog barking. This is part of the audio evidence used as the basis for a lawsuit against me. However, simple audio analysis, triangulating the sound from 3 different points on my property line, reveals the barking originates not from my house, but from 2 houses down, the home of our HOA secretary. A collective gasp went through the room. The secretary turned ghost white. I clicked again. Selective enforcement, a grid of photos filled the screen. On the left, a picture of Mrs. Gable's tiny garden gnome, with the text of her $50 fine. Next to it, the basketball hoop, with its $25 fine. On the right side of the screen, my drone photos appeared one by one. Carol's incorrectly colored fence. The treasurer's massive, unapproved deck. The secretary's commercial catering van in her driveway. Underneath these images, I put the text, "Fines issued, $0. The murmuring in the room grew louder. I moved to the next slide, fiscal irregularities. I showed the landscaping contract value, and then displayed the quotes from 3 other companies, presented in a simple bar chart. The visual disparity was staggering. Our community, I stated, has been overpaying for landscaping services by an average of 38%, costing us tens of thousands of dollars a year. I let that sink in, then clicked to the slide titled Conflict of Interest. On one side of the screen was the state business filing for Covington Landscape and Home Services, with Darren Covington's name clearly visible as owner. On the other side, I displayed the sunny family photo of Carol, her sister, and her brother-in-law, Darren. The room exploded. People were on their feet, shouting questions. I held up a hand for silence and advanced to my final, devastating slide. Perjury, on the left, in large font, were direct quotes from her sworn deposition. "We always solicit multiple bids. I have no financial interest in any HOA vendor." On the right was the evidence I had just presented, proving those statements were lies. These statements, I said, my voice dropping for dramatic effect, were made under oath. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Carol Covington. Her face, which had gone from smug to shocked to pale, was now a mask of crimson rage. She started shouting, banging the gavel on the podium. "This is an outrage. This is slander. This meeting is adjourned." But no one was listening to her anymore. The gavel was just a piece of wood, and her authority had vanished into thin air. A man in the front row, a retired lawyer I'd spoken to briefly, stood up and addressed the room. "A motion of no confidence in President Covington and the entire current board is in order," he boomed. The clubhouse erupted in a unified shout of "aye" that shook the cheap acoustic tiles in the ceiling. It was a complete and total rout. Carol stood there, sputtering and defeated, as her little empire crumbled around her in less than 10 minutes. The treasurer and secretary looked physically ill, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The revolution was swift and decisive. In the chaotic aftermath of the no-confidence vote, an interim board was nominated and approved on the spot. It was comprised of several reasonable, respected residents, including the retired lawyer and, to her own surprise, a very flustered but determined Mrs. Gable. Their first official act, passed by unanimous vote right then and there, was to instruct the HOA's lawyer, who looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole, to immediately withdraw the lawsuit against me and to accept all terms of my countersuit. The following week, I received a formal, written apology from the new HOA board on behalf of the entire community, along with a check reimbursing me for every cent of Arthur Vance's legal fees. The new board, energized and committed to transparency, used my forensic report as their roadmap. They launched a full, independent audit. The contract with Covington Landscape and Home Services was terminated immediately. The last I heard, the board's lawyer was initiating civil action against both Carol and her brother-in-law to claw back years of overcharges for breach of fiduciary duty and unjust enrichment. Darren's business, which relied so heavily on the inflated HOA contract, folded within months. Carol Covington's downfall was absolute. Stripped of her title and her power, she became a pariah in the community she once ruled. Her public shaming was so complete that her house was on the market 6 months later. The for sale sign on her lawn, planted right next to her incorrectly colored fence, was a monument to her spectacular hubris. The lawsuit against me, the one for the phantom dog that started it all, was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed again. It was a footnote now, the absurd catalyst for a much-needed cleansing. The woman who had tried to ruin my peace over an imaginary infraction had lost her position, her reputation, and her home. She had called the cops on me for laughing, and in the end, the entire neighborhood had the last laugh at her expense. The changes in Westbridge Landing were not just immediate, they were profound and lasting. The dark cloud of petty tyranny that had hung over the neighborhood for years had been dispersed by the bright light of simple facts. The interim board, with the full support of the community, went to work rewriting the HOA's DNA. They used my report as a foundational document, not for revenge, but for reform. The first order of business was financial transparency. All contracts were put out for a public, competitive bidding process. Every major expense was detailed and explained in a monthly newsletter. They even created a simple website where any resident could log in and view the HOA's bank statements in near real time. The very idea of a secret, self-serving deal like the one Carol had with her brother-in-law became structurally impossible. Next, they tackled the culture of punitive enforcement. The entire book of fines and violations was overhauled. Vague, subjective rules were clarified or eliminated. The process for issuing a violation was changed to require photographic proof and a warning period, promoting compliance over punishment. The power to levy fines was removed from a small, biased committee and given to a more balanced group that included non-board members. The reign of terror over garden gnomes and basketball hoops was over. As for me, my victory was sweeter than I could have imagined. I had not only defended my own peace, but had inadvertently restored it for the entire community. I found myself in an unexpected position. I was no longer the reclusive forensic accountant who just wanted to be left alone. I was the guy who had slain the dragon. People would wave as I got my mail. Neighbors I'd never spoken to would stop me on my walks to thank me. I had come to this neighborhood seeking solitude, but had found community instead. The new board president approached me a month after the annual meeting and asked if I would consider heading a new, permanent financial oversight committee. The irony was not lost on me. The man who was sued for a fake dog was now being asked to be the community's official watchdog. I accepted. My role would be to review the books quarterly and present a report to the residents, ensuring the transparency we had fought for would become a permanent fixture. I had learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes, the peace you seek isn't a passive state of being left alone, but an active state that must be protected and, if necessary, fought for. My professional skills, which I had always compartmentalized to my office life, were not just a way to make a living. They were a tool set for enforcing fairness. The core moral of this whole saga is a simple but powerful one. Bullies, whether they're on the playground or on an HOA board, thrive on intimidation and opacity. They count on the fact that most people are too busy, too tired, or too scared to fight back. But their power is often a house of cards, built on a foundation of bluster and hypocrisy. A little bit of research, a methodical plan, and the courage to present the unvarnished truth are all it takes to blow that house down. Knowledge isn't just power. It's a shield to protect yourself and a sword to fight for what's right. So, what would you have done in my shoes? For anyone out there dealing with your own Carol Covington, remember this. Read your bylaws, know your rights, and never, ever underestimate the power of a well-organized spreadsheet. Justice isn't always handed to you. Sometimes, you have to meticulously document, plan, and present it yourself.